Hello, storytellers. We are talking about one of my absolute favorite things today, and that is reading like a writer. I cannot stress how important I think this is. All that boring, you have to read to write well. I don't necessarily subscribe to that, but I do think there's a lot of benefit from reading in the genre you're writing, and we're going to talk about how to do that in a really beneficial way. This is especially important for people who don't have a lot of time to read. But welcome to Bound by Words. My name's Madii. If we haven't met yet, I am a full-time editor and a fantasy writer. And make sure you subscribe if you're writing a novel and want to learn how to captivate your audience. I post writing-related videos twice a week, and I just want to jump right into it. So the biggest purpose, I think, for reading, if you are a writer, is to really see what works and doesn't work in different books. If you're reading a book and there's a dynamic that feels cheesy or overplayed or super predictable, that is a great cue as a writer that it's not something you should do in your book. I have come across this whenever I'm reading some of my old favorites from high school or some of the first books that I've collected, where all of a sudden something that I knew that I loved feels kind of fake or overplayed. And it's not that it was bad when it was written, it's that the market will evolve and, new things will swarm it and then get old and people will move on. So reading kind of regularly will let you know what works and what doesn't work, and that's going to change over time as well. The next biggest reason is being aware of market trends. Market trends are basically a big, broad, general way of saying what works and what doesn't work. If you're writing a vampire book, it's definitely not going to get as much traction as it would have, almost 10 years ago. And I know post-apocalyptic books were really in for a minute there, and I know a lot of people are sick of reading them, but I've had a couple pop up in book subscription boxes and forums and stuff recently, so it's nice to see them come back around. But in general, there are phases in every genre and for every age group, and you want to make sure that if you're writing something, even if it's something that's not on trend right now, you want to make sure that you're aware of things that might be taboo, that might hurt your novel. So this could be different in every genre, but you just want to make sure you're not holding yourself back. But those technical things aside, the best and most important reason that you should read if you're a writer is to stay creative and to stay original. Creativity is a muscle. Writing is definitely something that you have to exercise and get better at. And I think the more you read, the more exposure you get, like we said, the first thing, to well-written work, but also the more exposure you get to different and vibrant ideas. You don't have to go into writing a book with just the fairy tales you knew as a kid and the movies you've liked to watch. You can go into writing a book with, stacks and stacks and stacks of different unique genre-based stories that are either similar to or marketed to the same audience as your book. I will say that if you are a writer, it's not just that you should read to write better, it's that you should read in the genre that you want to write and market to. It's great to read other things for personal growth. I like to read a lot of books on how to write better, and, I'm a developmental editor, so I want to make sure I stay on top of those kinds of trends. But reading those books might help me with the process of writing or thinking about writing, but nothing will help me come up with original and fresh ideas like being aware of what's already in the market where I am, writing to. Now, there's two very important different types of reading. The first is active reading and the second is passive reading. Active reading is where you sit down and you really want to absorb something. This happens a lot with self-help books or, note-taking workshops, anything you have to read for a class that you might want to memorize, anything that you have to interact with or that you're really trying to digest is active reading. So textbooks in school, if you're reading slow, if you're taking notes, if you're marking things. And then there's passive reading, and these are definitely my terms, so they're probably not used by a whole lot of other people, but passive reading is whenever you read to enjoy it. You don't spend the time to sit down and think about it. You don't spend the time over-analyzing. You don't try to memorize anything. You just read and you enjoy it. And this is a lot of what we see in the book talk and bookstagram community is people reading books and giving their reviews and their recommendations. And I have a couple, I think, really good hacks and really good ways that you can turn passive reading into something that can actively help you. I don't think it's worth it as a writer, if you don't have time to read, to spend time reading a book that you normally would enjoy and would normally want to passively read, but turning it into an active or painstaking process. Now, I will say, if you have the time and you read often, it might be good to take a couple well-received books and actively read them. If, you're hitting your Goodreads goal and then some, and you're like, well, the next book I pick up, I want it to be famous in my genre, and you're going to sit and you're going to break down why it turned out so well, I think that is amazing. But if you are busy or maybe can't read as much and you just want to read for the sake of it helping your writing, then it's definitely important to take passive reading and make it a useful tool for you so that you can enjoy what you're reading without adding any other stress to your life. So this middle ground between active and passive reading, I like to think of it as like passively reading but being mindful. It's really good for not just writers but also people who critique books, whether you're a book reviewer or you're just an Instagrammer and you want to post like lovely quotes or, aesthetic anything, whether you make book merchandise. There's like a bunch of different categories that I think that this would be good for, but I definitely push it for writers, and I think that there are a lot of readers who might do this naturally just because they get really excited about it. So I think the first and most important thing is if you're going to start weaponizing your passive reading as a tool for writing, you should do it one thing at a time and get used to that before you start expanding on it. Because the shift from reading and enjoying it and doing nothing to reading and learning from it and taking notes and making tabs is going to be so different that you don't want to rush and add too many things on and then get overwhelmed. If you've ever tried to annotate books, I think that's like a great example. A lot of people like the way annotation looks or they like the sound of it, but doing it once or twice can be really overwhelming. You have to build the habit up from the ground up. So start with passive reading, a book you would normally enjoy, and we're going to do one beneficial thing at a time until you're so comfortable with it, it feels normal and regular and it's like weird to not do it. Then when you get to that point, you can add another beneficial thing to your passive reading. And the reason I like to call this passive reading while being mindful is because the first thing we want to do is we want to be aware of the general norms in the genre that you're reading. Just general tropes, being aware that they're there, mentally noting them, saying, okay, this is something that happened and I know it's happened in more than one book. Be aware of point of view and also, like chapter length, stuff like that. For example, there's a big market trend right now for dual point of view, and I think a lot of people are trying to stand out by doing single point of view. Just being aware that those things are happening as you're reading is something that doesn't really take away from the reading experience, whether you're doing audiobooks or physical books. This works for both of them. Just saying, okay, there are more than one point of view, and making a mental note of how often it switches or is different between books. Maybe in your genre, you notice that all of the chapters for almost all the books you've read are short, and then you get to one book and it's like, wow, the chapters are a lot longer. It's just good to make a mental note of those things. And I think for a lot of people, that one's really easy to jump on and get comfortable with. So the next thing I want you to do is I want you to write down, note whatever way is easiest for you that won't disrupt your reading, places where you get overly emotional, frustrated, or bored. Any kind of emotional reaction you have to this book, especially if you just have to take a moment to either reread something or just heavy sigh, or like I've been buddy reading with my sister lately and it has been wonderful. And sometimes I just have to text her like, where are you at? I can't believe this happened. So while you're reading casually and you are just enjoying what you're reading, when you have a strong emotional response, mark that. The reason this is good for book reviewers is because it gives you good hot points to talk about, questions, stuff like that. And if you make book merchandise or anything like that, it'll give you instances to pull from that are memorable. The reason this is good for writing is because it'll show you what to do and what not to do in situations. If you read 3 whole pages and you're like, I couldn't care less about what was going on, you can just put a little tab on it. Maybe if you get flags, everything red could be interesting, everything blue can be emotional, and everything green can be boring. Whatever system works for you, or you can pencil things in. I know a lot of people are gonna cringe when I say that. I think writing in books is okay. I definitely have lines, I'll write in all of my educational books with pencil, and I won't write in any of my special edition books, but anything in the middle I think is fair game. Ebooks definitely, mark those things up. In audiobooks, you can save clips. So whatever is easiest for you with the system that you're reading, just make a note of those really powerful and important parts, because what made that story boring? Is it that they went on and on about one thing for too long? Is that they're just going over the travel and that's not the reason you were reading the book? That will give you a cue as a writer to avoid and not do those things. Similarly, if you're overly emotional or frustrated and invested, that's a good thing because the author was able to really draw you into their work. So even if you're mad that the characters are all acting wrong, and Kashi feels passionate about this, even if you're mad that the characters are acting wrong, that is the writer writing a realistic person who messes up and grabbing your attention. So it's good to know. But yeah, that is step 1, I think, when it comes to passively reading and being mindful. From here, we can start to get a little bit more active, but not in a sense that's going to disrupt our just pleasure of reading the book. So the first thing is noting what common elements are of your genre. And we talked about this earlier when we were talking about why things are important. is the current trends. You can see sort of what's common and what's uncommon, and do the uncommon things stand out in a good way or a bad way. For example, in fantasy, I think uncommon magic systems stand out in a really good way because it's something that's new and fresh that the readers are going to grab onto, especially if it's well written. I think the same thing was true for dual point of view books, but people gravitated towards it because it was amazing, and then it became common. Now it's becoming less common for single point of view, or maybe they're on equal footing here. And these mental notes are usually things that are talked about in the trope category. So like the one bed trope that people talk about, whether it's enemies to lovers or friends to lovers, things like that are in this category of you might have to dissect it a little bit more than the general, like, whose point of view are we in, and is it in first or third that we were talking about earlier. But you'll be able to collect a whole pool of more targeted and specific instances of things that work and don't work for your novel, or things that are common or are not common, which brings us to the next point, and I think a lot of people can sort of smash these into two, is what elements are in your story, or do you want to be in your story? And by noting or marking or even just being aware of those elements in other stories, you can help improve how you do it, or if it's original, or even if it just needs to be altered or changed or removed entirely. I think a really good example of this is, for a really long time, there was always a really old and, tall, dark, and handsome guy love interest, and it was always a young, naive, maybe like new to a world female love interest. For a while, that was a dynamic that everyone sought out, and you can tell if you go online now, a lot of people are just fed up with it. It's just been done so many times. So if you want to have that age gap and you are reading and you're noticing that it's not really common anymore, and you're seeing people who have like reviews where they're like, oh, they did this thing that like everybody does, then that gives you a good indicator as a writer to write something a little bit more unique. Maybe you can take that original trope that you wanted and switch it up some way. No matter what, whether the element is important to your genre that you're writing or your audience that you're writing to, or if it's important to your story, I think you should mark it. And the reason I think that you should mark it, and remember, we're doing these things one at a time, so get really comfortable with one thing before you start incorporating something else. The reason I think you should mark these instances is because it's going to give you a really good reference for when you're writing. If you're getting ready to write the first kiss scene and you're like, oh, I want to make sure that I write it in a way that is really powerful and memorable, and it's like a really big plot point, then you can go back and you can say, okay, well, what books did I read that had a really good first kiss scene? And did I make any notes around that scene that made it really memorable or not? Or for a less specific example, books that have really great cultures, I think, holidays that they celebrate, or religions. I think that there are a lot of examples of when that's done really well and when it's not done so well. So I have a lot of books that I have noted. I think Dark Skies is one. I don't remember if that's the first book or not. I think Dark Shores might be the first book. I think that book has an amazing culture. So I have notes in that book of things I think it did really well, because there's two very distinct cultures and they just stand apart from each other in a way that's incredibly unique. So I think I recommend that book kind of often. But just having references like that makes it so that if you're ever in a rut in a section of your book, you have something to go to and to reference and to compare and see if there's something in your book. Is it that you need more dialogue? Is it that your scene is too short and it should really be longer and more drawn out? There are little things like that you don't really notice until you compare things side by side, and you definitely don't want to compare the quality of your first draft to, or even your second or third draft, to the quality of a published book, but you want to use these books as inspiration. Books are basically success stories for writers, so you want to use them as a tool whenever you can, especially if you're finding things that you don't like. If you ever find something you don't like in a book, mark it, write it down, make a separate notes list. If you have things that you don't like in a book, there's chances are that other readers don't like that as well, and you might not even notice that it's in your book. You might not like a certain character dynamic, and it might accidentally sneak its way into your book somewhere in the background. You might not like how somebody's red herring was like super like predictable and almost unbelievable, and you might accidentally do that in your book. So using these books as success stories for things that are done well, but also things you didn't like, are, I think, really powerful tools. Also, just, I feel like the people who enjoy writing the most are usually people who really enjoy reading. There are a lot of people who like the idea of writing, but not writing itself. And there's a lot of people who like the idea of being a published author, but not necessarily creating the story. So everybody falls on a different line of that sort of spectrum. But I think to every degree, you either love reading or you love the idea of reading. And I think that for the people who love the idea of reading and can't always make the time to do it, or can't make the time to do it as much as they want, making making it a useful tool that'll benefit your writing life or, you know, your social media platforms, your book reviews or content creation, making it beneficial in that way will make it a more practical thing. I think my brain really likes to do practical things. So I've been getting into a lot of audiobooks for that reason, because I can listen to an audiobook and then go about my day and do chores and go shopping, and it's great because I feel like I'm getting a lot done. So making your reading important and useful makes it so that you're getting more than one thing done at once. You're reading for fun, but you're also, you know, learning and finding good writing examples, which is one of the biggest things that I think everyone should take away from this video, is that this should not be strenuous. It should not be extra. The reason you want to do these things one at a time is because you want to do them in a way that is comfortable and enjoyable. This is about, you know, reading like a writer, not reading like somebody who's studious, who studies their books all the time. You want to read in a way that is fun, and if you enjoy reading, like I said, you might already regularly read. This can be an extra like additive or addition. I also think that it's good to note that you don't have to do this for every book you read. Some things will start to come naturally, and that's why you want to do things one at a time and build a habit. You might pick up a book and go, oh, this is dual point of view. The last 2 books I read were dual point of view. You might pick up a book and say, wow, this is written from a little girl's point of view, and I actually haven't written a book like that. I don't think that I remember. Noting little things like that are going to feel more natural the more you read, but you don't have to commit to doing this sort of mindful passive reading with every novel. Maybe every other novel you just sit and enjoy and don't think about, and you only make notes whenever it's super important, and whenever you start doing that, it'll sort of sneak its way into your life pretty fast. But if you've enjoyed this video or you've learned anything from it, make sure you hit the thumbs up, but also consider subscribing while you're down there. I post writing related videos twice a week.